Welcome to Kitchen Sink Dharma. Now, a lot of the stories that we most enjoy in films and in novels tend to involve a degree of conflict. They contain what we call binary oppositions. So there's two diametrically opposed characters or groups or points of view, and the dramatic tension comes from the fact that they're not able to coexist. And of course, usually the opposition is between good and evil. And happily, good usually prevails in the end. And as a storytelling device, it's great. It creates some dramatic tension for us, even if as a way of actually seeing the world, it has its limitations. But there is a lot of it about, and it's not just in films and in fairy tales, it's also in the way that we interpret our world. It's a very simplistic way of seeing things. But we seem to be drawn to that. We seem to be drawn to the sense of certainty and consistency that it offers, even when it's not the most helpful thing. And so today I want to talk a bit about how this practice, this path, requires us to be able to cope with a bit less certainty and to be able to live with a certain amount of contradiction sometimes. In some schools of Buddhism, there's something called the two truths teachings. And it's the idea that there's relative truths and there's absolute truth. And relative truth tells us that we're solid, separate entities. It's a dualistic view. It says that I exist as a separate being and the world can be divided into me and everything else. And on the other hand, absolute truth is a term used to describe a very different way of viewing the world. It's a perspective that brings in emptiness. It brings in interbeing oneness, if you like. It's the idea that I'm intimately connected with everything and everyone else. So everything exists as a constantly flowing, changing interplay of phenomena. And sometimes this idea of two truths is described as a provisional teaching because, of course, ultimately there's only really one truth around how we exist. There's just simply two ways of looking at it. And we can always say there's more than one way of looking at the same thing. What if I both have a self, but at the same time I don't? Or what if everything's real and everything's an illusion? And I'm not throwing this in to create confusion or to give you a headache, but really just to introduce the idea that different things can be true at different levels. So in the same way that quantum physics tells us that different laws apply at the atomic level, because subatomic particles behave differently. They don't just behave like tiny little billiard balls. It's a whole set of rules, a whole new set of rules at that level. And what that says to me is that it can be actually really helpful for us to be able to cope with realities that sometimes appear to contradict each other. The philosopher Jacob Needleman once said, "Stay with the contradiction. If you stay, you will see that there is always something more than two opposing truths. The whole truth always includes a third part, which is the reconciliation." And that's what today's about, how we can train ourselves to stay with the contradiction and allow in the reconciliation. Because in any spiritual or philosophical tradition, there are contradictions, or there are apparent contradictions. There are contradictions within what I talk about in this podcast. So, for example, one of the ways that we practice metta, or practicing friendliness or loving kindness, is to wish other beings safety and happiness and health and ease of mind. And sometimes we use phrases, metta phrases, we call them, like, may you be safe, may you be happy, and so on. But you could argue that what we're wishing for is that things should be different. And actually, maybe we should be just accepting things just as they are. So with something like that, for me, there isn't a black and white answer to this question. I think it's something that requires some inquiry, some engagement. And also, another example, while I'm at it, we're encouraged to make wise choices, to exercise discernment in where we direct our attention and who we spend our time with. But that seems to contradict the idea that we're practicing mindfulness as a way of accepting whatever we encounter without judgment. And again, I think that part of our practice is about how we engage with things that look contradictory. And the realization came to me quite early in my practice that this path requires some work. There isn't a prescription that tells us exactly what to do and what to believe. We have to work a lot of this out for ourselves. And some of what we're practicing has to be understood from different perspectives, depending on how we're going to apply it. And there's actually schools of Zen Buddhism that actively promote contradictions as teaching tools. They use what's called koans, which is questions or riddles that don't actually lend themselves to an obvious answer. And it's all in the service of awakening. And you might have come across the idea that there's no path and no goal. or as the philosopher and the monk Nagarjuna said, no difference between nirvana and samsara. So in other words, no difference between complete liberation and the endless treadmill of suffering. And statements like that used to make me go, wait, what? In that case, what is it that I'm doing? Why am I even practicing? What am I doing here? And there's a tendency in me to want to just filter something like that out and just to move on and leave it behind. But I think it's actually designed to protect us from a tendency that we all have, which is to fit whatever we hear into our existing worldview and to try and make it compatible with our preferences. So when I talk about training ourselves to be able to stay with contradictions sometimes, I'm talking about cultivating a mind that's quite pliable, quite open, maybe a bit less religious, maybe a mind that can eliminate some of the certainty. And this is not about saying that all points of view are equally valid. And when we're engaging in contradictions, they don't have to be symmetrical. So often one side of the polarity is more useful or more meaningful than the other. And neither do we have to find a spot right in the middle and just place our flag there. This is about full engagement with ideas. There's a very old idea that's sometimes referred to as the coincidence of opposites or the unity of opposites, and it goes back thousands of years, actually all the way back to Heraclitus. And it's based on the fact that apparent opposites are often not as irreconcilable as they seem. So what we call opposites are actually often facets of the same thing. And there are countless examples of how opposites coexist, how they often give rise to each other, and often one can't exist without the other. So for example, without light, there's no shadow. And our ability to hold both of them is a really helpful skill. And to understand this, especially given our tendency to feel more comfortable when we've taken a position on one side or the other. And those of you who are parents will understand this because, for example, we work hard to protect our children from germs and from infection. But we know that some exposure to germs is important. It's actually necessary even. So we naturally try to protect children from uncertainty and risk, but if we take that too far, we make them more vulnerable because they can't cope with adversity when they do encounter it. So once you actually start looking and start being aware of the idea of the coincidence of opposites, you find it everywhere, and there's a real richness that comes from seeing the world through this lens. And of course the idea of yin and yang expresses this beautifully, this idea of two opposite forces that need each other. In the story of the Buddha's path to awakening, he starts off living in a very privileged world with every comfort and pleasure at his disposal. And he's got entertainment on tap. And then he goes in search of the truth and he subjects himself to all sorts of terrible austerities. So things like refraining from eating or drinking to the extent that it nearly kills him. And according to the story, he only becomes fully awakened after he ends his fast and eats some rice and milk. And then he discovers the Eightfold Path, also referred to as the middle way. It's called the middle way because it avoids the extremes on either side of self-denial and sensual indulgence. So the term middle way is later used to describe a philosophy that avoids other extremes, like the extremes of existence and non-existence. And the idea of middle way can be applied to any pair of diametrically opposed ideas. Again, it's not about finding a compromise, it's about escaping from rigid ways of looking at the world, freeing ourselves from binary thinking. And the physicist Niels Bohr actually once said, in order to answer questions of interest, we often need to change focus. And I think that's just as true of the Dharma as it is of physics. We need to be able to adopt diverse perspectives. He talked about this ability to change focus as an attitude, as an approach. And that might mean using different ways of looking at things to answer different kinds of questions and to source different types of insight. So this next one to me is a lifetime's inquiry. It's the understanding that our well-being is bound up with that of others, and that gives rise to compassion. But a completely open, boundaryless sense of oneness leaves us too vulnerable. We have to preserve, at least to some extent, we have to preserve the boundary between self and other. And that doesn't mean that either oneness or separateness is the right way to be. It doesn't mean that neither of them is the right way to be. It just means that we have to engage with the opposites and find a middle way. Not a compromise, but a middle way. And it's one that allows in some uncertainty and some inquiry. Because we like absolute truths, but they tend to unravel quite quickly. And we like clear, simple answers, but often they're just not available. So the first time I went to India, it was particularly difficult when we encountered children who were begging on the street. People said to us, don't give them money, because they're just organised by gangmasters and the children won't see any of the money. You'd just be supporting criminals. So we tried carrying food around with us. We'd take a bag of apples or some biscuits. And sometimes the child who was begging would accept something to eat, or sometimes they'd throw it on the ground and demand money instead. And I really wanted to know how to handle this. I wanted to know what the right answer was. What's the right way to respond to children when they're begging? And of course, there is no answer. There's no simple answer. It's an unanswerable question. And ultimately, we have to learn to live with an awful lot of unanswerable questions, for all that we wish it was otherwise. So human suffering isn't a problem that's ever going to be solved. And there isn't a simple hack, there isn't one weird trick that's going to fix it all. That's a fantasy. And when we're too fixated on the pursuit of happiness, we also often become less happy. And when we try to avoid the reality of suffering, we suffer more, but we still have a choice. So instead of looking to fix everything, we can actually follow a much less fearful path, because there is a path through the middle of all of this. And it's not always an easy one. It requires that we make some effort, but it's there. And sometimes it requires us to negotiate some contradictions. And as Alan Watts said, what the middle way really comes to is not moderation, it isn't compromise, but really a profound understanding of the unity that underlies all oppositions. So that's this week's episode of Kitchen Sink Dharma, and thanks for listening. Hope you can join me again soon.